Right. So, yeah, good afternoon today. And for my presentation, I'm going to be speaking a bit about an amazing discovery that happened in Whitehorse in 2012, a really interesting skeleton that we had the pleasure of excavating, and then other ruminations about bison history in the Yukon. Um, in the Yukon here, we often think we're just absolutely swimming in steppe bison fossils. And this is a beautiful reconstruction that Julius Chitani did for his for a project we worked on in the Northwest Territories based on a specimen from Sikajik. And I just love this beautiful rendition of steppe bison with their big curled horns, the big humpy back, and on that mammoth steppe landscape that we envisioned for the late Pleistocene in Beringia. And we know a lot about bison in Beringia because, like I said, we have a lot of their fossils, and it's really one of the first, first animals that was studied for ancient genetic purposes and things like that. So in terms of understanding big population level questions about Beringian bison, we've really tackled that question, those questions quite well over the last number of years. And specifically, we did a really great job, I thought, in 2017 when a group of us put together a story about the first entry of bison into North America. So we know that bison were an Asian species that eventually crossed the Bering Land Bridge and made their way to North America. And we know this happened around 160,000 years ago based on a specimen, a fossil foot bone, a metacarpal that was found at the site on the Porcupine River called Chi-Chi's Bluff. And some amazing genetic results came out of that. 160,000-year-old bison bone yield DNA, and we were able to put together this phylogeny, kind of telling us about the history of bison moving back and forth across the Bering Land Bridge in North America during the Ice Age. But and like I said, bison are a real big thing here in Beringia because we find lots of their fossils. And if we wanted to come up with some estimate of their abundance, I would say 80%, maybe 90% of all the fossil bones we find from the Pleistocene represent these Pleistocene steppe bison that I'm holding here. But one of the great things about the work that we do in Yukon in archaeology and paleontology is the work that we do with the public and how the community can get involved in some of the heritage research that we do. And one of the great examples of this collaboration with the public really started in 2012 with this family here. So this is Craig and Sandy Duncan, and they're local Whitehorse residents. I know one of the little guys there went to school with my son. And in a small town like this, people kind of get to know each other and kind of get to know what each other does for a living. And I think Craig had an idea that, those guys over at that office are probably interested in old bones because back in April 2012, we were sitting around having coffee at 8 a.m. in the morning or whenever it was. And Craig walked in our office door and said, yeah, I heard you guys deal with old bones. And he pulled a couple bones. I don't know if they were in his pocket, but pulled them out of a bag or a box and said, yeah, I found these while I was excavating my basement in Porter Creek. And we looked at them right away and said, whoa, those are bison, and they're very, very well preserved. This is really interesting. He said, yeah, well, if you're interested, you can come check out the site, and we're digging around there and we'll have a go. So of course, it was April. We had been sitting inside all winter, and we were just roaring to go to get out and do some field work. So we went over to Craig's spot and realized, wow, this is very, very interesting. So this is a spot in a neighborhood called Versluce Meadows in Porter Creek, Whitehorse. And you can see the excavation trench that Sandy and Craig had dug for their water line for their house. And while he was digging, he found those bones and thought, well, we better assemble a small team and just see what's going on at the site and see if there's more of this bison to be found. So just to situate ourselves in geographic space, so you can see the town of Whitehorse where we live, within the region known as Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge here exposed between Asia and North America. And we'll notice that Whitehorse here is, during the late Pleistocene, was covered by continental ice sheets. So immediately when I saw these bison bones and I thought of, just realized, Whitehorse it was a glaciated region. So these bones either have to be really recent, so post-ice age, or they have to be pre-ice age. So there's some story going on here about the reason why we'd have such a beautiful bison preserved in Whitehorse. So here's a Google map showing the city of Whitehorse. You can see the Yukon River flowing through basically in a south to north direction here. And this is the neighborhood of Porter Creek. So the site that Sandy and Craig were digging is at a locality called Versluce Meadows. And if you can notice this part of Whitehorse, you can see some small lakes. I think this is known as Stinky Lake by local people in Porter Creek. And you can see because there's small kettle lakes, this area has got a really kind of high water table. And this region around Versluce Meadows, where Craig and Sandy were building their house on the edge of it, was historically known as a place where you could have hay fields, because it was sort of a swampy area, an ephemeral slough that was quite productive for hay meadows. The area is also within the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dun and the Taungkwachon First Nations. And so when this was discovered, when Craig brought these bones into our office and we started this little project, we called them immediately and let them know, yeah, there was something really interested in Porter Creek, and come check it out. So again, this is the meadow. So this is known as Versluce Meadows. You can see it was sort of a snowy day the other day when I snapped this shot, but it's a low-lying kind of slough area that, like I said, people cut and grow hay here. So that's Craig there, and alongside one of our now retired Yukon archaeologist, Greg Hare. And of course, Greg was standing there thinking, man, we got a bunch of government guys showing up at my dig site or my work site. This might take some time here. And Greg was probably the hardest worker that we had. And of course, he was also the oldest guy on the project, so he directed traffic. So he said, folks, get to work. And this may have been a day where we kind of put our backs into our job. And so this is the basements. This is the area here where Craig was building his house. And you can see it's sort of at the bottom or downslope from a ridge top where, you can see this low-lying meadow area being in the local geomorphology, the local landscape. And as soon as we got to the spot, we started scratching around and we noticed, yeah, there's more bones. And this is part of his excavation trench. And we see another piece of bone sticking into the wall. And this is Elizabeth Hall here, one of the paleontologists of the program. And she really jumped in and took control of the excavation because as we were walking around and looking at the site, we were noticing bone everywhere. And so Elizabeth really kind of took control of the excavation to make sure that we were all, in the right direction and doing this properly. And part of this is because, Sandy and Craig were trying to build a house and they didn't want an archaeological dig going on in their house spot for weeks and weeks. We really needed to move quickly because, we have a very short building season in the Yukon and Whitehorse. So, the discovery of something like this could have the potential to really tie up the house building. So we wanted to make sure we get this job done quickly. So, we pulled out shovels, we had trowels, we did a very, very quick sort of a salvage excavation because we kept on finding more and more bones from this bison. So after one day of excavation, we had people started to get excited in the neighborhood. And here's Elizabeth here with her mom. And we had people, we called our families, people in the neighborhood got really excited and wanted to come help and hang out and see what was coming out. And you can see after just a few hours of excavating, we started to run into a real bone bed. And you can see this pile of bones. You can see part of the skull, part of the mandible, and other long bones emerging from the ground. Here's another family, the Doolings showed up. They wanted to help as well because their son, Marcus, had found a piece of bison on Fish Lake a few weeks before that. So bison were really in the news at this point in Whitehorse. And after 2 days of this digging around and excavating and kind of searching through the whole site, and Craig helped out using a backhoe, we uncovered the better part of a single skeleton of an ancient bison in these sediments that were being excavated through to build this house. Craig's friends also showed up and people he knew, it just became a real kind of point of excitement in the neighborhood at this in April 2012. As these bones were emerging from the ground, we laid them out on tarps and sort of put them in anatomical position so people could actually see, you know, this is actually a skeleton emerging from the ground. This is really cool. And you know, get a chance to participate in the discovery and excavation of this specimen. So the next step, of course, local news. I see CBC here showing up and interviewing people and talking to people. And yeah, you know, we're so used to finding fossil bones of steppe bison and other ice age animals in the Klondike or up in Old Crow, but for something like this to be found in Whitehorse was really remarkable. And like I said, this is a region that was covered by ice sheets, so there was lots of questions that we had while we were just excavating the skeleton. One of the most precious parts of the skeleton was the cranium, the skull. So you can see these horn cores, it's the back of the cranium here. And we wanted to make sure that we had that taken out completed. So we got that out and took it back to the lab. And that was, we knew that the cranium would be really important because all people that work on Pleistocene mammals and bison specifically know how important the skull is for determining what type of bison this is. My little field assistant here, this is my son Roman, who's now 12. He's 4 years old in this picture. You know, I was really trained in earth sciences and paleoecology and things like that before I got into vertebrate paleontology. So immediately when we got to the locality, Elizabeth took over digging the skeleton and I wanted to check out the section. I wanted to see the sediments. So we had a look at the stratigraphy exposed in these sediments that were being excavated through. And it was absolutely amazing. And you can see this photograph here. This is calcareous marl sediment. So this is essentially silt and sand filled with shells like this, mollusks and gastropods and bivalves. So that was really exciting to us. So we collected huge bags of bulk sediment for this, of this sediment, because we knew that it could provide some really important paleoenvironmental information about the site. So after 2 days of messing around at this spot, we finally dug out what we thought was most of this skeleton. We collected as many samples as we could, and then we let Craig and Sandy get on with their house building, and they are now living in that house today, almost 9 years later. So, you know, we're so thankful to Craig and Sandy for first reporting this discovery, and then and allowing us to dig around in their dirt and then to perform the scientific research on what they found. Like I said, there was a lot of stir at the time. You know, even the Globe and Mail, the CBC reported. My favorite quote from this project is when Craig was in the newspaper talking and saying, yeah, these researchers got pretty excited. It was pretty funny. They just basically all came running. And it was really like that. That April morning, we got so excited, got our field gear and just came running to go look for this bison skeleton. And it was definitely a lot of fun. So that winter, we had a summer or winter intern, a high school student who helped prep out this skull and make sure that it was stabilized and glued and could be studied further. And of course, it's a lot of work doing this cataloging and preparation work on fossils. And in the end, we recovered what was the better part of a bison skeleton. And the first, we can see for sure that there's certain parts of it are very well preserved, other parts of it aren't, and other parts of it are missing, and other parts are complete. So there's lots of clues within the skeleton that can tell us a lot more about the life of this animal. The first question that we had, first of all, because we really had no idea how old this specimen was. It could have been 50,000 years. It could have been predating the Wisconsin glaciation, or it could have been, you know, post-glacial. We really had no idea. So we cut off a piece of this bone right here. That's a part of the tibia, and we submitted it for a radiocarbon date. So this is John Southern at the University of California, Irvine radiocarbon dating lab. I'm here with my friend Ross McPhee. And John Southern is a radiocarbon dating wizard, and I always trust his work. So we sent our samples to him. And this is a time scale from the end of the Ice Age here on the left, about 12,000 years ago, to modern times. And the radiocarbon data came back and it placed it right in the middle of the Holocene, about 5,400 years old. And we were super excited about that because we knew it's such a beautiful skeleton and it had huge horns. And it made me really wonder about the identity of this bison. So before we really started the work on identification of that bison, once we knew that it was 5,400 years old, we became quite interested in the paleoecology, because we knew this region at one time was a slough, like it's an ephemeral slough that dries up and gets wet in the spring, then dries up in the fall. And we wanted to know a bit more about the history of this low-lying meadow in Whitehorse. So like I said, there were some amazing calcareous marl sediments with all kinds of remains in them, including all these shells. And we knew there would likely be plant remains in them as well. And this was a bit of a throwback to a lot of the work that I did as a master's and PhD student, where I looked at plant macrofossil remains from the Ice Age. So I spent hours and hours at a microscope picking out seeds. And this are some of the beautiful macrofossil remains that we had. We have some Potamogeton and Nias, some different types of aquatic plants, carex sedges, spruce needles, Chenopodium, which is a forb that lives in a herbaceous plant that lives in generally dry types of environments, or often saline environments. Some beautifully preserved mosses and bryophytes that Catherine Lafarge from the University of Alberta looked at, and then also some beautiful shells that Andre Martel from the Canadian Museum of Nature looked at. We also had Rolf Matthews, who was my old PhD supervisor, look at some pollen grains so these are fossilized pollen grains that were recovered from the sediments. These aren't the actual pollen grains themselves. Unfortunately, I ripped these off the internet, but just to show you what some of these different types of pollen grains look like. And the pollen spectra preserved in these sediments is really dominated by spruce. So spruce trees, birch trees, and then alder trees, and then some sedges. So that's the typical type of pollen flora you'd expect from a boreal forest type environment dominated by spruce trees. But one of the really cool things about the pollen spectra is that it totally lacked pine trees. And we know that that really confirms regional pollen diagrams from southern Yukon, which show that pine trees probably only arrived from the south in southern Yukon around 2,000 years ago. So there was throughout the Holocene, a northward migration of pine forest. And it didn't arrive in the Yukon until 2,000 years ago. So when this bison was living in Versluce Meadows 5,400 years ago, it was living in a boreal forest type of environment with spruce trees and birch trees and sedge wetlands, but there was no pine around. So that's a very different type of habitat that we have than what we have in the region today. We also know, based on the analysis of some of these gastropods and mollusks, that there was an extensive wetland in that area 5,400 years ago. And today it's kind of an ephemeral slough, kind of a pond that dries up seasonally. But these different types of mollusks that were preserved in these sediments told us that it was a very extensive lake at one point. So that probably means that some of those small kettle lakes that are in the area were probably connected and formed a large, extensive permanent lake body in the neighborhood. So in the end, after we looked at the skeleton, we were able to put together a diagram of what was preserved and what wasn't preserved. So everything in gray here are bone elements that were preserved and recovered during our excavations. So one of the other questions that we wanted to ask was how old this bison was when it died. So we know it died 5,400 years ago, but how old was it when it died? And we can use some osteological tools about the skeleton to find out how old this bison was. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at the fusion of the bones. So, in most mammals, when they're very young, the ends of the bones aren't fused. And here, this is the radius bone, so the lower arm bones, or the forearm bones of a bison. And we know that in bison today, that bone fuses at about the age of 6, or after the age of 6. So the end of the radius bone should be fused by the age of 6. The other clue that we saw were in its vertebrae. So the one on the left here is one of the cervical vertebrae, the third cervical vertebra. And we see that the centrum is not yet fused. And along with other markers of partial fusion on the thoracic vertebrae, we know that this bison was probably about 6 years old when it died. So it was not an adult individual, it was probably a juvenile male. So how did this juvenile male bison die at the age of 6, 5,400 years ago? So again, we can look at osteological clues in the skeleton, what's there and what's not, and how are those bones preserved to tell us about this. So we'll look at some of the lower distal limb elements, and I think that provides the best clue on how this animal died. So we look at the feet. So on the left are the forefeet, on the back are the back feet. This is the metacarpal, the metatarsal on the right. We can see that these small phalanges and hoof bones are totally complete. And they were found in growth position. So they're found in anatomical position in the sediments. And they were totally perfectly preserved. We can also see, if we look on the back legs, on the tibias, that in both cases, both tibias, the shin bones are perfectly cracked. They're broken right in half, roughly in the same place in both bones. And that's really interesting because those are spiral fractures. Those are the types of fractures that happen when the animal's living. Those aren't the type of fractures that happen after death or through some taphonomic process. Those happened when the animal was alive. We can also look at the chest cavity. So if we look at the rib bones, these were all the rib bones that we were able to recover. And the thing you'll notice is that they're totally smashed up and they're broken. So that's really interesting because there are a lot of rib bones, but most of them are missing, and what's present are broken. The other clue comes from the humerus bone, which is the upper arm bone. And you can see on this humerus, there's incredible evidence of chewing and gnawing on the proximal ends, just on the proximal ends, not on the bottom ends or the distal ends. So you can see these beautiful teeth marks and chewing to get at the inside of that humerus bone. The tibia has the same thing as well. So these are providing me with lots of clues about what I think happened 5,400 years ago at this pond or this lake. So what happened? What are these osteological markers? What can we do with all this evidence and put it together to tell us what happened 5,400 years ago at Versluce Meadows? So some of those clues being the lower limb bones, the feet are perfectly complete. They were found in growth position anatomically, and they're all present. All those bones, small bones, are present. Then there's incredible gnawing on the upper parts, the proximal parts of both the humerus bone and the tibia bones. The femurs are totally gone. We couldn't find them. We couldn't find them anywhere. So the femurs are gone. And then other parts of the skeleton, like the scapula, the shoulder blades, and the pelvis, are all chewed up. So what's going on here? I think if we put all this evidence together, one of the things that comes together is that we see the head and the cervical vertebra, and all these lower elements are complete, while everything above it are either destroyed, missing, or totally chewed up. So I think what happened 5,400 years ago, that there was this young juvenile bison. Maybe it was in the spring while he was walking out on the ice, or maybe he was just hanging out on the lake edge, and then his feet got mired down in the mud and basically stuck. And I think that soft mud provided this kind of like quicksand type situation where this bison got stuck in the mud with all 4 feet, and it started struggling to get out of the mud. And then I think it broke its shin bones. Both of its tibias are snapped right at sort of a level you'd expect if it was mired down in the mud struggling. The tibia bones snapped in half, and then it probably fell. With most of the weight of a bison is on its front leg, so it probably just collapsed, and then got stuck in the mud. And eventually, maybe it got frozen in there. That frozen, the mud could have froze. And then wolves came along. And totally destroyed parts of the carcass which were exposed. So I think the feet bones, all the feet were stuck in the mud and unavailable for carnivores, because if I was a wolf, I would probably go after the feet first. And that's what we see in a lot of sites where there's carnivory, is that the wolves will go after the feet first because they're super tasty. They got lots of fat and other gelatinous tissue. So the fact that the feet bones are in the phalanges and the hoofs are so well preserved and complete tells me that the wolves didn't get at them because they were mired in the mud. So I think the wolves got into the chest cavity, started chewing on ribs, started chewing on vertebrae, dragged the femurs away, and then basically destroyed whatever part of the carcass it could. So again, there's another photograph of a typical gray wolf devouring the inner part of a bison carcass. So the next question, we thought we figured out what happened to this bison. Then we wanted to know what kind of bison this is, because anyone who studies bison knows that there's a whole mess of different types of names for bisons out there. And, Pleistocene workers have been discussing the taxonomy of bison for well over 100 years and come up with these different classifications for different types of bison that lived in North America during the Pleistocene and post-glacial times. And largely, these classifications are based on horn cores. And you can see some of the variability in some of the different types of horn cores. So A here is bison latifront, which is the huge horned bison which lives in the southern parts of North America during the Ice Age. On the left are bison priscus, which are the typical Pleistocene bison from Beringia up in northern Canada and Alaska. And then bison on the right, which is their modern form of extant bison. So when we did all the measurements on this beautiful cranium, and you could just see the size of those horn cores and the width of those horn cores, it's a big animal. And when we put the measurements and compared them with all the different types of classifications, we could either call this a bison priscus or bison occidentalis, which are typical Pleistocene forms of bison. It's not bison. It doesn't have those small horn cores like the extant wood bison or plains bison do. So are we really saying that we have a 5,400-year-old steppe bison from Whitehorse? Yes, we are. And with the way we confirm that information is through ancient DNA. So we sent a sample of this bone to the paleogenomics lab at University of California, Santa Cruz, and Pete Heinzman and Beth Shapiro. And happy birthday, Beth Shapiro, if you're out there, it's your birthday. And they do amazing work on bison. And they've been doing amazing work on bison DNA for a long time. And this is a shot from the lab here. And over the last 20 years or so, people like Beth Shapiro and her students have been really picking away at our understanding of Pleistocene bison. So we know a lot about the genetics of Ice Age bison. And the real key point to this is that we can clearly separate bison that were found in the south of the continental ice sheets in North America. So southern bison are very genetically distinct from northern Pleistocene bison. And when we look at the sequence of this specimen from Versluce Meadows, it shows that the mitochondrial sequence from this 5,400-year-old bison clearly fits within the mitochondrial diversity of all Pleistocene bison or bison priscus from Beringia. So we can clearly show that this is a bison that descended from these bison populations, these steppe bison populations that were widespread in Beringia during the Pleistocene. So we know that that population of Beringian steppe bison continued well into the Holocene in Yukon. We published these results in the Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences in 2017, revealing some of the new information we obtained from the skeleton and some of those results that I spoke about. We had a wonderful little ceremony at the Kwanlin Dun Center, where the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Taan-Quechan Council recognized Craig and Sandy and and we also have Marcus Dooling here for the discovery and reporting these wonderful fossil remains that were found within their traditional territory, and really trying to show the public how important it is to report these discoveries and the types of information that can be obtained from them. So when we started to really put this story together in terms of our understanding of bison in Beringia, like I mentioned, we know a lot about Beringian bison because of the numerous fossils that we have from them and also the extensive genetic studies that have been done on Beringian bison. And we always have to think of bison as being one of these really important members of this mammoth steppe fauna that was widespread in Beringia during the Wisconsin glaciation, probably the last, probably about 12,000 to about 60,000 years ago. And really, that's the height of the last ice age in Beringia, when it was incredibly cold, incredibly dry, and these widespread steppe tundra grasslands sustained populations of large-bodied grazers. And we find lots of the remains, animals like woolly mammoths, steppe bison here, of course, from the Klondike goldfields, and horses. But unlike steppe bison, woolly mammoths and horses go extinct in North America near the end of the Ice Age. Well, we know now with lots of different types of data that steppe bison persist into more recent times. And of course, these are all animals that sort of moved back and forth between Asia and North America across the Bering land bridge. But we know that once that land bridge was severed, the connection between the two continents was severed by about 11, 12, or 12,000 years ago due to global warming and post-glacial environmental change and sea level rise. We had the continuation of horse populations in the old world. We had the continuation of mammoth populations on islands in Arctic islands in Siberia and the Bering Straits. But we also know that some of those Beringian bison populations persisted until relatively recently in Yukon and Alaska as well. And we know that people have always had a very close relationship with bison from the Ice Age on. Of course, in Europe and in other places, we have these amazing paintings of bison that were painted by people. There was technologies adapted to hunting bison throughout the Pleistocene. And we think of those lifeways probably largely continuing after the Ice Age, that important relationship that people had with bison. In the Yukon and Alaska, in post-glacial times, in some of those earliest archaeological sites, there's lots of evidence that those earliest people in North America, say 14 or 15,000 years ago in the interior of Alaska and Yukon, were certainly hunting bison. And some archaeologists like Ben Potter have suggested that maybe microblade technology, which you can see here, these bone antler points, or bone or antler points with these slotted microblades, may have been really effective hunting weapons for these large-bodied bison in the early post-glacial and post-glacial times in Alaska and Yukon. We know in other parts of North America that bison were an incredible food source for people. They were a very important food source. So people were hunting bison across the plains, and they were really part of that economy and the culture of indigenous people in North America. Within the Yukon specifically, there's been some really interesting ethnographic work that has really shed some interesting light on recent bison in Yukon. And this is where that sort of anthropological angle really comes in, where we can start to integrate findings from ethnography and linguistics to really help us inform the archaeological and the paleontological record. And that's one of the wonderful things about working in the Yukon and working with people, in the indigenous people in the Yukon that have this deep history on the land that we can look at. We can talk to people who live here and talk to people who have relatives and ancestors that live in the Yukon, and they can really inform our understanding of animals and people in the past. And specifically, one of the really neat pieces of information that we've been able to come up with comes from the Tlingit language. So Tlingit speakers are inland speakers around the town of Teslin. These are people that had very close connections with coastal Tlingit people in Alaska. And their traditional territory encompasses south central Yukon, including the area of Whitehorse. And when Catherine McClellan, the anthropologist, was in Yukon, southern Yukon in the 1960s and 75, or in the 1960s and 70s, she wrote about a story that was told to her about Beaver Man. And she wrote about this in 1975, and it's in her classic series, My Old People Say. And within that story about Beaver Man, there's a mention of buffalo hunting. And I know that in the description, when she spoke to local people at the time, they clearly knew the difference between moose, bison, and muskox. So when people were talking about bison or buffalo, wood buffalo, as people often say, they were clearly talking about bison. So, and it's really cool because in the inland Tlingit language, they use the word chas in reference to wood buffalo. And that word was used by Elder Johnny Smith from Kwanwin First Nation. I had a little sound clip, but I can't seem to get it working right now, but he uses the word chas when he's describing wood buffalo hunting by people that, so he remembered when he was a kid that his grandparents would tell him stories about going hunting for bison way up in the upper Pelly River drainage, so up against the Mackenzie Mountains in the eastern part of Yukon. So suggesting that there was bison populations still living there, probably sometime in the mid-1800s or earlier. And that information is really confirmed by other oral histories and ethnographic stories as well. So if we look at the Gwich'in country in northern Yukon, around the area of Old Crow, these are people that are directly connected to people in Fort Yukon and other parts of central Alaska. And then there's some words and suggestions based on those oral histories as well, that they talk about these cows of the forest. And when they were spoken about, they were clearly referencing bison. They weren't referencing muskoxen or moose. So there's a Gwich'in name for the cow of the forest that was told to them by some of the missionaries in the mid 1800s or late 1800s in Old Crow. And the local Gwich'in people talk about their ancestors hunting these animals only a few generations ago. So there was likely bison there in North Yukon or in the interior of Yukon and Alaska until the mid 1800s or so, based on those oral histories. And with the archaeological record, there's some confirmation of that information as well. So this is a bison molar that was excavated from an archaeological site at Any Ned Creek, which is in southern Yukon on the Alaska Highway on about halfway to Haines Junction. And the radiocarbon date on this molar is 400 years old. And mitochondrially, it fits within the lineage that includes Bison priscus, the Pleistocene Bison priscus, which also includes this 5,400-year-old specimen from Versluce Meadows. So we know that lineage that includes Bison priscus is part. Our Versluce Meadows bison was part of that lineage, but we also know that lineage lasted until at least 400 years ago, and likely up until the 1800s, based on the oral history interview information. Because we know that's the early European folks, like the fur traders from the Hudson's Bay Company, like Robert Campbell, and the early people like Schwatka, who were exploring the Yukon in the 1850s, late 1840s and 1850s, they do not mention bison at all. There's no mention of seeing any bison on their travels. So it's likely that they were gone and extirpated locally around 1850, I'd say. So we all know what happens to bison in the late 1800s throughout most of North America. The governments hired people to go kill them en masses to make way for settlers and all that. And there was tremendous changes that happened to bison populations. There was huge bison population bottlenecks throughout most of North America because of these massive killings of bison that happened. And in the Yukon in the 1980s and 90s, there was a massive reintroduction program, because we know that those native bison populations that were descended from steppe bison were lost sometime in the 1800s. So there was a real interest in the 1980s and 90s to reintroduce bison into the Yukon. And at the time, there was 170 animals introduced, and now they've taken off. There's 100 or over 1,500 of them roaming southern Yukon. And they're really limited by, there's not a lot of hunting pressure, and wolves don't seem to know what they're doing. And there's been a lot of interest in working with First Nations communities in the Yukon in terms of their cultural connections to bison and what that means, that reintroduced bison. What does that mean to Indigenous lifeways today? So here's one of our beautiful Yukon bison here. We see them on the road. So if you're driving the Alaska Highway or some of the roads to places like Ajax Village, there's a good chance you're going to see bison in southern Yukon. Our Department of Environment has a program where they're out counting them. They tag them and they monitor them, so they have a fairly good idea of where the bison populations are living in the Yukon and how many of them are there. They live in the most fantastic places. This is a beautiful shot up in an alpine meadow. We've seen bison using the alpine all the time. They use the valley bottoms, they use the alpine. So they're really kind of very adaptable to the different types of habitats that are present in the Yukon today. Bison are also really important culturally still to First Nations people, but also to non-Indigenous people. So a number of the schools, like Elijah Smith Elementary School and Hidden Valley Elementary School, do cultural bison hunts every winter, where they go out with First Nation communities and hunt bison, and they learn about the biology of bison, the cultural understanding of bison. So it's a very enriching experience for young Yukoners to go participate in these types of experiences. And bison are really becoming an important animal. You know, it was only a few years ago that Barack Obama named, I think it was bison was the national mammal of the United States. And there's all kinds of conservation efforts that are happening in Canada and the US, and also some amazing conservation efforts for bison happening in northern Mexico, because we know back in during the Pleistocene that bison were found all the way into Mexico as well. So these reintroduction of bison herds into northern Mexico, I think, is an amazing step forward in really sort of rewilding bison back in North America after the massive population reductions that happened in the last couple of centuries. And so, you know, this is a story that that unfolded because Sandy and Craig Duncan were very generous with their time, and they reached out to the Yukon government and reported this amazing discovery of the skeleton while they were building their house. And we really wanted to use this opportunity just to remind people that if they're out there hiking or hunting or canoeing or doing whatever they do, if you're in Whitehorse, there's a chance you could find some amazing artifacts or bones or skeletons like this. So if you do find something like this out on the land, please report it to us, because you could be discovering something that has major scientific significance, like this skeleton and so many more of the artifacts and fossils that are reported to us by the public. So if you are out there and you do have, you know, you potentially may find things like this, fossils and bones. This is some of the contact information for the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Taan Council and Yukon government. So please reach out to us. Reach out to the First Nation governments, reach out to Yukon government, and please let us know what you find, because you know, we're here to help. These are resources and artifacts and fossils that have the potential to educate the public, and they're admired by the public. So they're public resources. So let's make sure that we protect them and celebrate them and study them together. So with that, I will end here, and we can open it up into questions. And hopefully we have some questions and some comments, and we can go from there. Cool. Hi, Keisha.
Hi. So our first question is, is there any evidence of humans using the area where the bison remains were found?
Well, that's a really good question. And because when we got out to the site in April of 2012, you know, there was 3 or 4 archaeologists. We all kind of put our archaeology hats on while excavating the skeleton. And Christian Thomas and Greg Hare from the archaeology program were firmly involved in the recovery of the skeleton as well. And we looked really hard for stone tools. You know, we really were excited and kind of hoping we'd find some stone tools, because that would be a really easy explanation for why that bison was there. And we looked for projectile points. We looked for evidence of cut marks on the bones. We looked for you know, any kind of butchery marks, and there was nothing like that found at the site. And even once we got back to the lab and looked at the skeleton in more detail, there was absolutely no evidence of any kind of human modification of the skeleton. So we know that this was certainly a natural death of the animal, but we know that in the region, in Whitehorse, 5,400 years ago, of course, there was people around, and they were hunting bison, they were hunting caribou, they were hunting moose. We know from places like the Ice Patch archaeological sites up in the Alpine that people were going up there and hunting caribou. But the evidence for bison hunting is really sporadic throughout the Holocene. And one of the things that, after, you know, talking about this project a bit, is you know, we really want to work with the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and Taan Council. The other day we met with Diana Jimmy from Kwanlin Dun and Anne Marie from Taan, and we're really thinking this might be a good opportunity to sort of further that knowledge and pull together some of the archaeological evidence and ethnographic evidence to try to really kind of better understand how people were interacting with bison here in the Yukon since the end of the Ice Age. And yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff, especially as we pull together some of that traditional knowledge about ancient bison, or, you know, not so ancient bison hunting.
Cool. So the next question is, Have there been a lot of Holocene bison remains found in the Yukon?
Yeah, actually there has been. And I probably, if I was better prepared, I would have put together a map with all our bison remains. But, that's actually a really good point too. We've talked a lot in the program over the last few days about, there's lots of archaeological sites in the Yukon that have tons of butchered bone. But often that archaeological butchered bone is really difficult to identify. So it's smashed, it doesn't have the morphological landmarks you'd use to identify bones. So what we're thinking is maybe trying to employ some methods like protein analysis to try to identify some of the bone, because we think there might be a lot more evidence of bison hunting and butchery in the archaeological record than there actually has been reported. But yeah, every once in a while people find bison teeth or mandibles around Yukon. And so we're slowly building this chronology and history of ancient bison in the last 10,000 years in the Yukon. And to me, the kind of the holy grail would be to find a bison with a radiocarbon date that's, say, 200 years old, because the most recent radiocarbon date from Annie Ned Creek is only 400 years old. But the oral history suggests that there was bison maybe 200 years ago in the Yukon. And I would love to find one of those bones and radiocarbon date it and find out and try to confirm that, because they have to be there. And all it takes is somebody out on a hike to find a bone, pick it up. You might make a very important scientific discovery. So yeah, we'll find it. It'll get found.
So the next question is, did you also date the sediment with an OSL? And if so, was the date similar to the radiocarbon age?
No, we did not date it with OSL. No, we didn't. That would have been one of these things if we would have had a lot more time to, yeah. But I think we're confident that the age of the sediments reflects the age of the skeleton, because we took the bulk sediments that we did the paleoecology with directly from that bone bed. So, there might be some offset on the age of the death of the animal versus the age of the sediment deposition and some of the plant material and organic material in the sediment. But yeah, but we didn't do that.
So the next question is from Facebook, I believe. Have you attempted to extract environmental DNA from the soil to identify other fauna that lived alongside the specimen?
Yeah, no, we didn't. And, back in 2012, we weren't really thinking about that kind of stuff so much, where environmental DNA now is so commonplace. That's 9 years ago. And no, we didn't think about that at the time. We have lots of that sediment remaining. But the problem is that sediment wasn't frozen and it wasn't sort of a waterlogged. So I'm not sure if ancient DNA would be preserved well in that sediment or not. But yeah, that might be something, if Craig or his next door neighbor ever plan on digging another basement, maybe we'll have to ask him to open that up again and have a look at the sediments another time.
So you mentioned that 80% of Yukon's Ice Age faunal remains recovered are bison. Is this sample a bias, or do you think it represents natural diversity?
I think it actually represents the diversity of the late Pleistocene. And so, that's really based on when we show up at a placer gold mine near Dawson City, and, we can show up there. Elizabeth and Susan, part from the program, will show up at a placer mine, and there'll be piles of bones, hundreds and hundreds of bones laying around that are collected, very recently. And yeah, I think that has a fairly good representation of the natural sort of faunal assemblage, because, maybe 1 out of 100 bones is a carnivore, 5 bones are a mammoth, 10, I think we're dealing with natural death assemblages, and that's a real contrast to sites, say, like the La Brea tar pits, where they're 95% carnivores. I think in Beringia during the late Pleistocene, I think we should stop calling it the mammoth steppe and start calling it the bison steppe, because bison certainly were the most abundant animal on the landscape, and they were certainly the largest part of the biomass for large mammals, for sure. I see Greg McDonald is asking about small vertebrate remains. we screened lots and lots of sediment for mollusks and gastropods and bivalves and plant macrofossils. We didn't recover any beetles or any insect remains, and we didn't recover any small mammal vertebrates at all. So, and I was a little bit surprised by that. But if these are lacustrine sediments, the chance of finding small microteins in lacustrine sediments are probably a lot less than finding them in, say, alluvial gravels or sands.
So the next question is, was there morphological divergences, for example, in size, between European bison and those that thrive in Beringia?
Oh, for like European wisent? Yeah, the thing is, I think one of the things we're learning about bison through all these genetic studies and morphological studies is that, bison have a lot of variability. Their morphology can evolve and change very rapidly, because we know that when bison first enter the New World, cross from Asia into North America across the Bering Land Bridge, and they arrive in the southern parts of the United States, and they develop those massive bison latifrons horns. That adaptation happened very quickly, probably in only a few generations, hundreds of years or thousands of years. So we know that those morphological variability that we see in bison fossils across North America really represents a lot of morphological diversity with very little genetic diversity. And I think that's kind of one of the lessons we're learning, is just because they have different horn cores doesn't mean that they're different species. They just have different horn cores, and they develop different horn cores based on different social environments and other physical environments. And bison are just really malleable, and they're malleable. They can eat a lot of different things. They can live in a lot of different habitats. And that's probably why they survived the end of the Ice Age extinctions, while horses and mammoths just don't. And they survive up until the 1800s in the Yukon, because they're very adaptable. Which leads me to wonder, why did they all die out in the Yukon sometime in the 1800s? And I don't know. That's a great question. I really hope that, working with the First Nation communities and other archaeologists and paleontologists, that we can try to ask that question and come up with some reasonable answers to it.
So the next is a teeth question. Can bison teeth be used to determine how old a bison was when it died?
Yeah, with bison, they have growth annual growth annuli as well, or layers, and that is definitely a good idea. We could probably, it might be able to confirm or shore up the timing of death, because you might be able to see a signal for whether it was a winter death or summer death or spring death. So that's a great project. If the person who asked the question wants to do a graduate project or master's thesis, or I know there's my colleague Matt Wohler we're doing some amazing work right now on bison using annual growth increments in horn cores and also in teeth to look at seasonal variability. So I think this might be one of those bison will study as well, to look at those seasonal variations, because the difference between living in the Yukon winter versus Yukon summers is so drastic. And I think that's one thing people don't realize who study Ice Age faunas in other parts of the world, is those seasonal extremes in Beringia are incredible. So animals that have winter adaptations also had to survive, 24 hours of sunlight in warm summers. So yeah, those are the types of things we can look at as seasonal changes, and potentially look at seasons of death in these animals.
So since we're on the teeth question, do you know what causes the bluish color sometimes seen on bison teeth?
Yes, that's called vivianite, and that's it's a chemical that is found when plant or fossil remains are preserved in an anoxic environment, and often in permafrost. So, for example, like Blue Babe, the bison carcass, the mummified bison that was found in Alaska, it was called Blue Babe because of that blue vivianite staining that happens on organic materials preserved in those types of environments. So the Blue Babe, the skin of Blue Babe has this beautiful blue kind of shiny color. And we often see that on remains that are coming from the permafrost and the Klondike goldfields. Fossils like mammoth tusks are often blue stained. So it's called vivianite.
And another teeth question. Do you know of a way to tell the difference between bison teeth and the modern cow teeth?
Ooh, ouch. That's a tough one. I remember that reminds me of my maybe my second year like zoo archaeology class at the University of Alberta, where we're having to look at cow bones and try to separate them with bison. And yeah, it's very, very difficult. Um, that's all I'll say because I'm not really good at that.
So I think, well,
But I'm sure there's smarter people out there than I am, and I'm sure they could do a better job. I can help them out if they're looking for an answer.
so we have quite a few more questions, but I'll ask one more, and then maybe what we can do is try and get to the questions. But the last one is there if there are bison priscus are found in the Yukon as recent as 400 years ago, what caused their extinction? And if their extinction separate from the overhunting of bison?
You know, that is a great question. And I think, you know what, that's one of the wonderful things about like Yukon paleontology and archaeology is that we can, you know, the same kind of questions we're asking about, say, events that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago during the Ice Age, we can still kind of look at those same questions in more recent times in the Yukon. Because we know that these populations were here up until the 19th century, but then they were gone. And what drove those changes is a total mystery to me. And I think that is going to be one of those mysteries that I'm going to really tackle over the next bunch of years, because part of what really drives a lot of the work that I do is that I'm really interested in trying to figure out, you know, that process, those processes that led from the Ice Age to modern day times in terms of the environment, the climate, and the animal communities. And it just doesn't make any sense to me ecologically why bison would have dropped out a couple hundred years ago, because we know based on those reintroduction efforts of of wood bison that they're so successful today. They're really, really successful animals. And everything that we know about bison in terms of their ability to adapt to changing climates and habitats tells me like they survived the extinctions at the end of the Ice Age when so many other species went extinct. Why would they drop out 200 years ago? I don't know. Is it the little Ice Age cooling events? Is there something to do with, yeah, I don't know. Was there disease? There's a lot of, you know, these are the same kind of principles we're trying to apply. You know, we're trying to ask the same things about the Pleistocene record. And we can ask those about some of the extinctions that happened in recent times, or population level extinctions that happened in recent times as well. And yeah, if anyone has any ideas, let me know. I won't steal your idea. Please write a paper for me because I want to come up with an answer. And I know there's a lot of people who want to know that answer. And I hope that we can do some further research to try to further understand the recent history of bison.
Well, it sounds like there's still a lot of research to do, and we could talk about this all day. But with that, I think it's time to say thank you so much, Grant, for an awesome talk, and thank you for everyone who's joined us all across the world. Stay tuned next week as we'll be talking about, I believe, horses.
Yeah, next week we have Leo Avila from Brazil, who's going to be talking about the Pleistocene record of horses from South America. And they've been doing some really exciting stuff, looking at the pattern of extinction of horses in South America and what species they represent and how they may be connected to horses in North America and Beringia. So we're really excited that Leo's going to be here next week. And like I said, we're going to have archaeology talks, some paleontology talks. We're going to have some local talks, some exotic talks, but stay tuned, keep hanging out with us, and like I said, if you do find fossils, bones, or artifacts, call the local First Nation, call the Yukon government, and you have the opportunity to provide some new, amazing scientific information with your discoveries. So it's really important. And thank you for listening.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.